All right, everyone, back here live on PALS TV. Bring you our next segment, live from Gallia County. It was a fun start to our day with Art Outside the Lines, doing some drawing classes and teaching us some different techniques to do at home. Now we're going to jump into some education. Personally, some of my favorite segments here on PALS TV have been when we've had Ed and Brooke and then Dave come on, talk about some of the fascinating history that's occurred in that area. Love just hearing about the revolutionary times, the colonial times, and into the Civil War, and then modern day with a lot of the conspiracy theories out there. We went on a Bigfoot hunt last week in Gallia County. We've also did a tour of the Mothman Museum. So we love the history and all of the cool topics that come out of Gallia County. So Dave's going to do a segment on a lot of that history and teach us some of the early beginnings of this area in this region. So we have Dave from Gallia County.
Hey everybody, how you doing? Doing good. Give me a big wave here. Hello from Gallia County. Well, originally, you guys, Brooke. This is I'm being rude. I should have introduced my buddy here. This is Lee. Lee's in the Gallia program here, and we've been hanging out together this week, haven't we, Lee? So Lee decided that he'd be gracious enough to help me do a presentation today. So, but anyways, we originally had Brooke scheduled to do some history today, and she got pulled into a training at work, couldn't get out of it. So you guys, you got me today. So I'm not as pretty as Brooke, but I put a mask on so you didn't have to look at my ugly face. So, but who remembers, who was here on PALS TV the day that we did a live tour of the mural, the wall down on the river with all the paintings of the the Native Americans and the settlers coming in? Raise your hand if you're a part of that, if you remember that. So do you remember when some of I'm sorry, Lee, some of the statues that were there, like the big silver stainless steel statues we saw, what do we see, was it Lord Dunsmore? I can't remember his name, but there was also an Indian chief there. His name was Cornstalk. Do you guys remember that, Chief Cornstalk? Well, there's also, what other statue was there, guys? The Mothman statue. So any history, it seems like any history lesson we do for Gallia County and across the river at Point Pleasant, anything we ever talk about our history lesson always ends up being kind of, we always get pulled into the Mothman and the history of the curse of Chief Cornstalk. And so I remember when we were doing that tour that day, that I said one day we'll come back and we'll kind of revisit Chief Cornstalk and some of the, we'll talk about how the early Native Americans kind of pulled into the story of all the supernatural stuff down here, like the Bigfoot sightings, the UFOs, the Mothman, all the kind of weird things that's happened here, and how that actually was stemmed, believe it or not, from some of the early Native Americans. But we're going to start here with talking about some of these early Native Americans and what was going on back then. So my favorite early Native American story was always the story of Blue Jacket. So have you ever heard of Blue Jacket? Raise your hand if you heard of Blue Jacket. There's like a drama. I don't know if they still do that, but there's a drama around Xenia where they do the story of Blue Jacket. So what I'm going to do is I've got a bunch of information I'll be kind of reading off to you and just talking about some of these early Native Americans. The first one is Blue Jacket. And so I pulled up some information on him, and I'm going to pull this. Can you guys see his picture? I think it's kind of funny. His name's Blue Jacket, but what color jacket's he got on? Red. Yeah, I don't know what's going on with that. They need to figure something out. Whoever painted that picture. But actually, the story is, though, that he did actually wear a blue jacket. That was kind of his signature. So who was Blue Jacket? And why is he famous? Blue Jacket, born 1743, died 1810. He was a famous war chief of the Shawnee Native American tribe. Prior to the War of Independence, he led victorious battles against General Josiah Harmer and General Arthur St. Clair. He fought against the American colonists on the side of the British. So Blue Jacket actually fought on the side of the British against the Americans. But then he was forced to turn over Ohio lands to the United States. He joined the Western Confederacy in an attempt to regain Shawnee lands, and he died in 1810. So just a few fast facts about the Blue Jacket is the tribe. He was from the Shawnee tribe. There was, his lifespan was 1743 to 1810, so he died around in his 50s. You know, back then people didn't live very far past their 50s. If you were 60, you were really old. His alternate name is, and then give me a second because it's a really long name, Guayapir Senwa. Can you guys say that? Guayapir Senwa. That's Blue Jacket's actual Native American name. He was actually a war chief in the Shawnee tribe. That's right, he was, let me. His Native American ally that he worked with was called Little Turtle, and we'll talk about him in a couple of minutes. The European allies and wars that he fought in was he fought with the British in the 1774 Lord Dunsmore War. That is where we had the battle. It's now called the Battle of Point Pleasant, but originally over there where we took that tour, it was called the Lord Dunsmore War. And he also fought in the War of Independence. He fought in the Northwest Indian Wars in Indiana and Ohio. And he's also known as for fighting Little Turtle's War, which is one of his compadres there. The most famous battle he's known for was the 1794 Battle of the Fallen Timbers. But he's also part of, not only did he fight in battles, but he also was a part of peace treaties. So he's a part of the Treaty of Greenville, which is signed in 1795, and the Treaty of Fort Industry, which is 1805. So this Blue Jacket was definitely a war chief, a soldier. He was in, he spent his whole entire adult life in war, in battle, and was part of the Native American, what we consider a military back then. He's known as a war chief who opposed white encroachment, which he was against the white settlers coming in and kind of like taking up all of the indigenous Native American land. And he resisted that expansion. Little is known about his early life, and he appears in written historical records in 1773. That's when he first kind of shows up in history records, when he's already a full-grown Shawnee chief. Throughout his life with the Shawnee tribe, it is known that he fought under Little Turtle, which is one of his, like, I guess you'd call it a general. And they were at the forefront of the resistance of the settlers and the colonists who tried to expand on their land, and when they started to settle from eastern to the western part of Ohio. So if you guys remember that mural walk we did, you remember how the Native Americans, they had like a really peaceful, tranquil life. They hunted, they fished, they ran the lands freely. And then you notice as the settlers and the colonists came in, what they started doing with the land, they started chopping down the trees. They started, killing all the game for themselves. They started encroaching and just taking over the territory. And so that's kind of what Blue Jacket was a part of, was that resistance. So if you remember, you saw some battle scenes too, where the Native Americans and the settlers were going at it. And then you also saw some peace. There's a section where there was a peace treaty, and they were signing a peace treaty. So, following, I'll give you a little bit of his timeline here. So 1743 is born, 1774 Lord Dunsmore War, that's the tour we did. He was a part of the American Revolutionary War, fought on the British side against the Americans. And let's see here. I've already went over his peace treaties. So the thing, there's a lot of mystery that goes around with Blue Jacket. So when I was a kid in middle school, we had a class, it was Ohio history class. And so we had to choose a book to read about somebody from history's life. And so I chose Blue Jacket. So that's kind of why he's one of my favorites. But there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of like conspiracies or rumors that Blue Jacket was not really full-blooded Native American, but that he was actually a white settler colonist as a child. And the theory is that he was actually, if I remember right, he was, I think his family, the Native Americans came into his, the homestead and killed his family. And so he kind of escaped from them, but they caught him. And then instead of killing him, they took him back to their tribe and they adopted him. And so when he was, and that's kind of when he picked up the Blue Jacket, was he was, as he was growing, he had like the dress of like the white settlers back then. You know, the Native Americans wore like buckskin and had a certain kind of they had a certain kind of clothes style they wore, but he wore colonist type jacket, which was blue. And so that's kind of where that theory came in. Now that's been taught in classrooms for years and years, but when DNA technology came about, you guys ever heard of the DNA technology, where they take like cells from your body and they study it, and it's like a microscopic process, and they can match it with other DNA. Well, they did DNA testing on his ancestors, and they found out that he actually never was a white colonist, but he was actually a Native American the whole time. So those theories we were taught in school and learned and read about actually never really happened. So, or maybe they did. People are contesting it to today, but that's kind of a neat story. That's the mystery of Blue Jacket. So then we'll go over to, it mentioned Little Turtle. So do you guys remember it mentioned Little Turtle was one of Blue Jacket's commanders in the Native American forces, or their army that they put together. So Little Turtle, his real name was, give me a second, this is a long one, Michikinikiwa. Michikinikiwa. Can you guys say that? Michikinikiwa. That's Little Turtle's name. I think Little Turtle's easier to pronounce, don't you guys? But Little Turtle was a war chief of the Miami Native and the Indian tribe of the Great Lakes region. So Little Turtle was the northern part of the state. So you had Native Americans that were all the way from Gallipolis on the riverbanks up to the Great Lakes, up around your areas, Jonah, Toledo and Cleveland, and they were all over the state. There's actually, if you guys have ever heard of, the town Chillicothe, Ohio? Raise your hand if you've heard of Chillicothe. Chillicothe is actually the pronunciation is it's like Chilcawatha. And what Chillicothe means is it's an Indian name for a large gathering, or like a large village near a river. That's what that means. So a lot of our towns in our state and our areas have a lot of symbolism and meaning with what was going on as far as the original settlers, which were the Native Americans. And we just kind of adapted those words. So whoever thought Chillicothe was an Indian word, but it is. But anyways, Little Turtle worked with Blue Jacket and the other Native Americans during those times of the Lord Dunsmore War and the Revolutionary War. And let's see here. he had successfully led raids on the settlers in the Northwest Territory of Ohio and is famous for a victory known as La Bomb's defeat in 1791. So some of the fun facts about Little Turtle is that he was from the Miami tribe of the Great Lakes region. He was born in 1747 and died in 1812, 2 years after Blue Jacket. So once again, he was probably in his early 50s, maybe. He was a war chief. His alternative name was remember that, Michikinickawa. He was born in near the Great Miami River. And let's see here. His place of death was near Columbia City, Indiana. And, you know, back then they really, like, you know, we didn't have Indiana and Ohio. You know, all those states kind of blended together. Now, if you drive down there, you see like the state line that says "Welcome to Indiana." Well, they didn't have that back then. They just had territories that extended past that. So there really wasn't like state borders back then. They were beginning to have state borders, but that area on was definitely Indian territory. It wasn't. Well, I guess it was Indiana. They call it Indiana because of the Indian tribes that were there. Little Turtle was, so he was also like Blue Jacket. He was opposed to the colonists coming in and taking all the land. And he was part of the Miami tribe that occupied the area of, his area went from Indiana over to southwest Michigan and over to the western Ohio. He was raised in the Miami Indian Village and fortified a trading post of Pickawillani that was located on the Great Miami River. Oh, my assistant just left me. He's had enough. So Little Turtle was also part of the Lord Dunsmore War, and that's why he's on this segment today, because he was a part of that too, with Blue Jacket. And so you had like a lot of all-stars that were a part of that Lord Dunsmore War down here on the river. Let's see here. So he's also part of the Tecumseh War in 1811. And he also was part of the Great War of 1812. A lot of war back then. And he died July 14th, 1812. So now, another individual, another great Native American chief that was connected with Blue Jacket and Little Turtle and Tecumseh. You guys have heard of Tecumseh, haven't you? Tecumseh. There's like an outdoor drama in Chillicothe that's called Tecumseh. He was a part of that too. And another great chief that was a part of that conglomerate of Native American chiefs that come together to form these, you know, Indian armies was the one we've kind of adopted here in our area, was Chief Cornstalk. You guys remember we had like we had the statue of Chief Cornstalk down there on the riverfront. That's kind of the guy, that's our guy here that we talk about the most. So Chief Cornstalk, he was born in 1720, died November 10, 1777. He was murdered, and we'll get more into that. Chief Cornstalk was murdered by settlers. So he was a prominent leader of the Shawnee Nation. He was Shawnee too, just like the other ones. And his Indian name, or his Native American name, was Hokoleskuwa. I think Cornstalk's a lot easier, don't you? So, but Hokoleskuwa translate into, it's a translation, it's the Native American translation for a stalk of corn. So that's why they called him Chief Cornstalk. I always thought it was because he was tall and skinny, but it wasn't. It's just that that's what the name means. He also like joined these other Native Americans and opposed the European settlement, and was trying to beat the colonists west back or not west, but back east against and protect the west from the encroachment. But the difference with Chief Cornstalk and the other ones is like, but they were part of peace treaties too. But Chief Cornstalk played a big role in the peace treaty here after Lord Dunsmore War, and so he did oppose the European settlement west of the Ohio River, but he later became an advocate for peace after the Battle of Point Pleasant, and that's that tour we took with the flood wall. His murder by American militiamen at Fort Randolph, and I think they did a tour. I believe you guys had a tour of Fort Randolph a few weeks ago, but he was murdered in that area in Point Pleasant, and it was during a diplomatic visit in November 1777, and it outraged both the American Indians and Virginians. So Chief Cornstalk, out of the goodness of his heart, went to the settlers with a peace process. He wasn't coming to attack anybody. He was coming to actually work on a peace deal, and they lured him in there. And when he got in there, they kind of like captured him and murdered him. So, but early years of Cornstalk is that historians believe he may have been born in what's present-day Pennsylvania and moved to the Ohio country, near present-day Chillicothe. So Cornstalk was born in Pennsylvania, moved over to Chillicothe, and then was in the Chillicothe region down to around Gallipolis, but it wasn't Gallipolis back then. Stories tell of his participation in the French and Indian War also, and his alleged participation in Pontiac's rebellion in 1763. So going back to Dunsmore War, Cornstalk played a central role in the Lord Dunsmore War in 1774. After 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, settlers and the land speculators moved lands south of Ohio River into present-day West Virginia and Kentucky. And although the Iroquois agreed to give the land up, the Shawnees and the others had not. So there's a tension going between the Iroquois and the Shawnees over this now. The Iroquois still claim that southern Ohio, Kentucky, oh, he's back, and West Virginia area. They weren't going to give that up. But because the Shawnee were starting to back off, the Iroquois were starting to lose ground and momentum with that. So when the American Revolution began, Cornstalk worked to keep his people kind of out of it. He didn't want to get in the middle of it like the other ones were. And he represented the Shawnee at treaty councils at Fort Pitt in 1775 and 6. These were the first Indian treaties ever negotiated by the United States. Many of the Shawnees, like Cornstalk, hoped to use British aid to reclaim their land. So you kind of had, like, when the revolution was starting, you had like all these weird, well, not weird, but all these factions. You had the colonists, which later became your modern day Americans. You had the British were in there fighting. You had the French were stepping in a little bit. Then you had the Native Americans. You had all these factions of people. And so the British were kind of like promising the Native Americans all kinds of things if they would kind of help fight the white settlers and get them tamped down. So that's why the Native Americans were always fighting on the side of the British. So in the fall of 1770, Cornstalk made a visit to Fort Randolph, and this is where the story starts to get into things that like are supernatural that we talk about today. So Cornstalk made a diplomatic visit to Fort Randolph, which you guys had that tour, an American fort at present-day Point Pleasant. He was seeking ways to maintain so he was trying to figure out ways to keep his tribe out of the battle. He was trying to keep neutral of it. But when he went to talk to them and create a peace process, he was arrested by the fort commander who decided to take him on his own initiative. So, and he had a couple of his braves with him. So when they show up, this fort commander just kind of goes rogue and arrests him and his braves. So on November 10, when an American militiaman from the fort was killed and nearby Indians, so Cornstalk shows up to Fort Randolph, and he's there for peaceful purposes. And then what happens is, and it may not even have been the Shawnees, it could have been the Iroquois. Somebody from the one of the settlers from the local area was murdered by Native Americans real close to that area. So what happened was, that's why they kind of pulled Cornstalk into it, and he kind of got the brunt of the blame for it. And there's no proof that he was a part of that, or even the Shawnees were a part of that. There was just a murder by a Native American of one of the settlers. So when that happened, the militia, they were Cornstalk and his son and his two other Shawnees. So Cornstalk had his son and two of his braves with him, were taken and arrested and kind of put into a jail in a cabin. And so Private Jacob McNeil, one of the soldiers, so a private who participated in the capture of Chief Cornstalk, tried to. So what was happening was, they picture this, like they've got Chief Cornstalk and his son and his braves locked up, and all of a sudden a mob starts up because there was a murder of a colonist nearby, and so they're going to take it out on Chief Cornstalk. So this private in the militia named Jacob McNeil stands up, and he's trying to stop it. He tried to prevent them from coming in to get Chief Cornstalk. But when McNeil testified, he said that he was one of the guards over the celebrated Indian Chief Cornstalk, that when he was murdered, that he was like trying his best to keep the mob from coming in and killing him. So it was such a it became such an unpopular, vile thing that both sides, the Native Americans were enraged, and even the white colonist settlers were enraged by his murder, because he did nothing wrong. He just showed up to try to make peace. So American political and military leaders were alarmed by the murder, and because they felt like it was their only hope of getting peace together in that area. But now with that happening, they realized, like, that's not going to happen. We're going to go to war now, because we just murdered this famous, respected chief, and it wasn't even a battle; it's cold-blooded murder. So they were considered the men that killed Chief Cornstalk. Actually, everybody considered them vile assassins, and they actually were brought to trial, and I think they were executed over that. But it was still too late. They had murdered him. But the thing is, like, what leads us to where we're going is on. By the way, this is a picture of Chief Cornstalk too. So he's pretty majestic looking with his buckskin outfits and his feathers. But so what happened was, when the legend goes, is when they were when they were in the process of murdering Chief Cornstalk, he put a curse on that land, and that's so as he's being killed, he said something to the effect of, may this land have a curse on it for the next 200 years. And what he was talking about was the area we live in, the West Virginia area, the Southern Ohio area, that he put a curse on that, or spoke a curse over this land. And I think it was like a 200-year curse. So this is kind of why people always talk about the curse of Chief Cornstalk in Southern Ohio or West Virginia or whatever. You always hear about, if you go to, there's nowhere you could go in this area here and not talk about it, and somebody won't know what you're talking about. So, but this is kind of where the Mothman and the Silver Bridge kind of pulls in with the story. And I'll read you a little bit about the Chief Cornstalk's curse. So you guys, so now we're kind of caught up to speed now with how the Native Americans pull in with the Mothman curse, right? That makes sense to everybody. Like, you kind of see how it ties together. So almost 2 centuries before the shadow of the Mothman reared its head in Point Pleasant, the land of the Ohio River ran red with blood. As the inhabitants of the American colonies began to push their way to the west and later fought for independence from Britain, they entered into a deadly combat with Native Americans. Perhaps their greatest foe in those days was Chief Cornstalk, who actually became a friend of the Americans. But treachery and deception and the murder would bring out an end to Chief's life, and a curse that he placed on Point Pleasant would linger for 200 years, bringing tragedy, death, and disaster. And I'm going to read a bunch of stuff that's happened in this area just to show you, like, and every time something like this happens, people always talk about how that was the curse of Chief Cornstalk. So there's no denying that the southeastern corner of Ohio and that surrounding area is considered by many to be one of the most haunted areas of the country. West Virginia has been long thought of as one of the strangest parts of the country in regards to ghosts, legends, and strange happenings. Especially if you go to like the Mothman Festival, you'll see some strange stuff. This part of the country, which was originally part of Virginia, was regarded by the Native Americans as a haunted spot plagued with ghosts, lights, phantoms, and strange creatures. The town of Parkersburg, just north of the river from Point Pleasant, has more than its share of ghosts also, as well as Athens County, which is also home of the most haunted city in the entire state. But how did this happen? How did this place get such a reputation? And why is there stories about like the Mothman and phantom inhabitants, things like that? And they all think it's because of the curse. You know, they always have a theory it's because of Chief Cornstalk's curse, which would allow some, you know, phenomenon to happen and bad things. So let's see here. I'm gonna pull up a list here for you guys. Some of the things that's happened in Point Pleasant. Oh, here we go. Okay, so it goes back to like, oh my goodness, it goes back to 1907. So let's go back to 1794. So in 1794, the town of Point Pleasant was established near the side of the old fort. For many years, the Indians' grave, which is Chief Cornstalk, lay undisturbed, but in 1840, his bones were removed. So they started messing around with his bones after they buried him. I think that might have been what stirred all this bad stuff up, was as they kind of desecrated his grave, which means they just kind of started like disrespecting where his gravesite was. So in the late 50s, a new courthouse was built. They actually built the courthouse on top of his grave. You guys ever see that movie Poltergeist, where they built the house on top of a graveyard? All the weird stuff happened. Well, they built a new courthouse right on top. It's not where the courthouse is now today, but they actually built the courthouse on where his remains were. So they dug his remains up and moved them. So that was disrespectful there. I think so. So when they put to, so in August of 1909, if you remember the tour that Brooke and Ed did in the park, there's this like really long monument, really tall like tower. So when they went to put that tower up in 1909, there was a clear sky, not a cloud in the sky. And as they were trying to put it together, let me read it here. So originally the ceremony was set up for July 22nd, but the night before the event, a clear overhead sky erupted with lightning and struck a crane. So they were working on that tower, and out of the blue, this lightning came and struck a crane. And remember, this is kind of like where he was buried. So they're kind of like on his burial ground. But check this out. So everybody kind of freaked out over that. They were like, oh my gosh, I've never seen lightning. Usually when there's lightning, it's a storm coming and there's clouds. But no, it was like a clear blue sky, and all of a sudden lightning just started hitting their crane, tearing it up. But nothing ever happened again after that until July 1921, which was like almost 20 years later, or 10 or 11 years later, 12 years later, out of the blue. Once again, nothing, no cloud, no storms. Once again, that monument was hit by lightning again, and it actually, when it struck this time, it damaged the capstone and some of the foundation and granite blocks. That's weird, right there. So lightning hit it the first time they were putting it up, and then about 12 years later, out of the blue, bam, it got hit by lightning again. And this time, lightning did some pretty significant damage. I'd say if somebody was standing near that tower at that time, they probably would have been killed. So they attributed that to, guess what? Chief Cornstalk's curse. So 1907, the worst coal mine disaster in American history took place in Monaga, West Virginia on December 6th, when 310 miners were killed. That's 1907. And they contribute that to the Chief Cornstalk curse. 1944, in June of that year, 150 people were killed as a tornado ripped through that area. 150 people were killed by a tornado. Usually you see a tornado go through, you'll get 5-10 people will get killed, but like 150 people were killed by a tornado in 1944 by going through that area. So they contribute that to the Chief Cornstalk curse. 1967, the most devastating bridge disaster in history happened in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. This was the fall of the Silver Bridge. It was December. It was close to Christmas. It was an afternoon. It was actually evening. People were going home from work, and the bridge collapsed. And December 17th, I believe, 15th, and 46 people died like that instantly because the bridge fell. 46 people went to their graves. Some people report that they saw a big, large winged creature. And I'll let you guys decide if you want to believe this or not. But there's reports some people say they saw a large creature flying around that bridge right before it fell. Some people said they saw lights. But when that happened, they once again they attributed that to the curse of Chief Cornstalk. So you've got 1944, 150 people killed in a tornado goes through there. 67, 46 people die within a few minutes on a bridge collapse. 1968, a Piedmont Airlines plane crashed in August near the Kanawha Airport, killing 35 people on board. They contribute that to the curse of Cornstalk. 1970, on November 14th, a Southern Airway crash of a Southern Airways DC-10 crashed into a mountain near Huntington, West Virginia, which is just 35 minutes from Point Pleasant. 75 people were killed on board there. I think that's the, if you guys ever saw the We Are Marshall movie, that's what happened there. I think that was the football team was coming home. 1976 in the town of Point Pleasant, in the middle of the night, or not in the middle of the night, but in the evening, I guess, the Basin County Courthouse which is sitting where it's at now, they've rebuilt it, was blown up, 1976. So what happened is, and I'll read the story here. In March of that year, the town of Point Pleasant was rocked in the middle of the night by an explosion. Oh, it was in the middle of the night. That's right. By an explosion at the Mason County Jail. Joan, I think you've actually drove by that jail with me. Housed in the jail was a woman named Harriet Sisk, who had been arrested for the murder of her infant daughter on March 2nd. Her husband came to jail with a suitcase full of explosives to kill himself and his wife and destroy the building. Both of them were killed with law enforcement officers. So what happened was this young couple, the mother, for some reason, I don't know what happened, but might have been postpartum, but they had a brand new infant baby, and the husband, and they were both young, but the husband went to work and came home and the baby was gone. And the mother, come to find out, the mother had killed the baby and buried it in the cornfield behind the house. So the police came and arrested the mother and put her in that county jail. Well, the dad of the baby, he wasn't having that. Like he was taking her out. So he couldn't get to her. They wouldn't let him get to her to strangle her or shoot her or, seek revenge on her. So what he did, and this is back in the day before you could go to jail and visit people back in them days, like same with the airports, you could go get on a plane, you could walk into jail, you could do whatever. So he shows up under he tricks the law enforcement officers, and he shows up with a suitcase full of dynamite. And he decided, if I can't get to her, I'm taking her and myself out. So what he did is he told them that he had a suitcase of her belongings, and he's just going to drop it off because he was going to drop it off, be done with her, and never see her again. So they let him in to see her through the, he couldn't get to her behind bars, but he was in that hallway where he could see her. So I believe he wrestled away a pistol from one of the jail guards and was holding everybody hostage. And so, pretty much like he decided that he's going to take her out one way or another. So he realizes the hostage situation that he's not getting out of there alive. She's not going to get out alive. And so he ignited the dynamite and blew the jail up with the guards in it and himself and his wife. So that happened in 1976. And they attribute that to like that bad juju, that curse of Cornstalk. 1978 in January, a freight train derailed in Point Pleasant and dumped thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals all over the place. They were so bad that the town had to they had to abandon their wells, their drinking water, and fill them up. So it destroyed the drinking water in Point Pleasant. That's 1978. In April of that same year, town of St. Mary's, which is not real near Point Pleasant, but it's up the river, was struck by a tragedy when 51 men were working on Willow Island power plant, and their scaffolding collapsed and 51 men were killed. And so they kind of attribute that to the chief Cornstalk curse. So, but I think I'm almost out of time, but I will go. If you guys want to hear about the Silver Bridge collapse real quick? We could do that another time, couldn't we? I think I'm out of time, Jonah.
You are, Dave. Thank you, sir.
We'll cover the Silver Bridge collapse another time.
Yeah, I think we've had enough tragedy.
Well, it's interesting how it goes from, you can't, honestly, like I said it jokingly, but it's hard to talk about any kind of history in this area without going back to, the stuff that happens here and the suspicious, across the river. If I ever get a chance to, I'm going to take my phone and drive over there with you guys and do a tour. During World War II, there was they made dynamite across the river. And so there's all kinds of neat stuff over there. But yeah.
Now that's where the TNT area was.
Yeah, it's called TNT because that's where they made bombs for in World War II. So, and at one time the land was so polluted that they had to take, I don't remember how many square miles, but they had to come in with dozers upon dozers and equipment and dig out like a foot of the land. And it was multiple square miles. And I don't know where that soil went to, but it's gone. Yeah.
Good stuff, Dave. Thank you so much, sir. Always a pleasure. Another wonderful segment.
No
Live
problem.
from Galway.
All right, guys, have a good day.
You too, buddy. You too. So much history in that area, and we love being able to educate you on some of that here on PALS TV. So, all right. Well, we'll take another quick break. Come back and join our friends in Columbus. So stick with us on PALS TV.